everyone. And on behalf of USAID and Crown agents, I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining us here today, both in person and via webinar, for this exciting event in the USAID CEADIR Discussion Series. I'm Mikell O'Mealy, and our topic today focuses on helping developing countries that are most vulnerable to climate change impacts in their efforts to plan for and finance climate adaptation. We have a strong lineup of panelists for you today. Global leaders who are working to assist developing countries in creating national adaptation plans and in accessing, mobilizing, and implementing adaptation funds and finance. Before introducing the speakers, I'd like to share a little bit of information about this CEADIR discussion. CEADIR's full name is Climate Economic Analysis for Development, Investment, and Resilience. And it's a 5-year USAID-funded project that is helping countries to assess and scale up low-carbon, climate-resilient development. CEADIR supports countries in conducting the economic, financial, and other analyses that are needed to make the business and economic case for taking strategic climate change adaptation and mitigation actions. As part of the CEADIR project, this discussion series engages public, private, and civic sector leaders from around the world in exploring the most critical issues related to climate change adaptation, clean energy investment, and sustainable landscapes management. And through connecting with global innovators and practitioners such as yourselves, all of you here today, and all of us joining us via webinar, thanks everyone for joining us from around the world, we're able to share and build on each other's experiences and in the process become more effective as a global community in our collective efforts to address these critical issues. Kicking off our event today is Jonathan Cook, Climate Change Adaptation Specialist for USAID, who will give us a sense for the global landscape for adaptation planning and finance. Then our first panelist, John Furlow, a Senior Adaptation Advisor with the U.S. State Department, will speak to the work that developing countries are doing to plan for climate change adaptation at a national level. Our second panelist, Laura Würtenberger, who directs the Climate Finance Readiness Program for GIZ, will discuss global efforts to help countries become ready to effectively access and implement adaptation finance. Our third panelist, James Bond, who is Senior Advisor to the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, will tell us about how GCF is mobilizing funds for climate change adaptation and give us an overview of the first adaptation projects that GCF selected just 3 weeks ago for funding around the world. Then, the most important part of our event today is an open forum during which we will ask for your questions to the panel on these issues. So please be thinking about what you'd like to ask and be ready to type your questions in the webinar comments field for those of you joining us from around the world and raise your hands here in person today. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Cook to give us an overview of planning and financing for climate change adaptation.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to all of you for being here, both in person and online today. We're very excited about the panel and hope you'll find it interesting. And as Michael said, I'm a climate change adaptation specialist with USAID. And as she also said, I'm really here to tee off the panel to just introduce some of the basic issues and ideas to frame the discussion. You'll hear a lot more detail from the other panelists. So we all know, I think, that the costs of adaptation continue to increase. This graphic shows the range of estimates that have been made over the past years of those costs. And of course, there's some variation, but the trend has been an upward trend, I think it's fair to say. In 2007, the UNFCCC estimated that the cost of adaptation in developing countries would be about $28 billion per year by 2030. More recently, in 2014, in the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, they actually estimated about $300 billion per year by 2050. So clearly, a lot of this has to do with the lack of a global agreement to limit emissions and the fact that those trends are also continuing to rise. But in all cases, regardless of action being taken, and of course we hope to see a strong agreement coming in a few weeks and in Paris, these costs will increase, and we can disagree and differentiate between different ways to measure them and the numbers themselves, but I think there's common agreement on that increasing trend. So clearly, one of the most important issues when it comes to financing of climate and adaptation specifically is increasing the volume. We need more money, and there's absolutely no doubt that with adaptation, there's some challenges that are very specific to how to increase that volume financing. James will talk a little bit more about this in his comments, but from mitigation that make adaptation difficult to fund are the needs are often greatest in the poorer countries and in the poorer populations within those countries. Adaptation often relates to public goods. It often crosses sectors, so it's a much more squiggly, if I can use that word, area. It's harder to cover than something like mitigation. And it often comes up in areas and markets where things are not operating effectively, risks are high, information is limited, so the needs are harder to sometimes identify and match funding to. That's part of why we believe in the importance of mixed approaches to increase that adaptation financing. Public finance is going to continue to be a very important part of that. We're very excited about the Green Climate Fund and some of the other international funds. But of course, the private sector will be a key piece of the of meeting that challenge, of meeting that gap. Mixed approaches that combine public and private are going to be very important. And domestic budgets are also something that we see as a really important part of the puzzle. How to really mobilize countries' own domestic resources in more climate-smart, climate-resilient ways. The private sector really provides its own discussion, and while we'll get into some of those issues today, I think it's fair to say we could do another panel entirely on the importance of increasing the role of the private sector in adaptation. Some of the areas in which we see a particular need to increase that role are helping to identify the opportunities. After all, the private sector is looking for market opportunities. They're out there, but to help to identify them and work with our partners in the private sector to respond to them. Where are the incentives to manage risk for private sector firms? A lot of the challenge, I think, information, time horizons that don't always match up with investments, but there's a lot of risk that's out there, and I think, again, helping our partners in the private sector to find those opportunities and to understand those risks is a big piece of this. And then finally, improving the enabling environment in countries, in developing countries, for investment, because one of the things we see is if the enabling, the private sector doesn't necessarily want to come in and spend its money, and I think it's fair to say who can blame them. So these are key issues with the private sector that obviously we want to be responding to. And increasing the rate of volume and the resources available is a way to ensure that financing is more sustainable. And that's a big part of the adaptation financing challenge. But what I want to speak to today, and what I think our panelists will be getting more into, is what I call the quality of the financing. Because no matter how much money we have, it's also about how to spend it in ways that are effective, strategic, and that actually leverage transformational change, that actually respond to the adaptation needs that we're seeing in developing countries. And I think the three panelists are going to speak in many ways to different aspects of that. First of all, how to align the financing that's available with priorities that are actually strategic. And a lot of that depends on good long-term planning that involves all of the stakeholders and that identifies the right priorities, the most important needs. That also helps to ensure that donors and other institutions that are supporting countries are coordinating and are aligning behind a set of priorities. So we'll hear from our first panelist on the National Adaptation Planning process, the NAP process, which is one of the, I think, more exciting ways that alignment is starting to happen. Second, as Mikell said, readiness for climate finance. This is a whole area that really relates to, again, how to strengthen the enabling environment, both for private sector investment, but also for more effective use of public funds and domestic resources. How to make sure that the institutions, the policies, the plans line up in a way that makes climate finance that's available more effective. And so again, mobilizing and managing the funds in more effective ways. And so our colleague from GIZ will be talking about work on readiness to help developing countries in that area. And then finally, I would mention the importance of, again, responding to some of the needs and gaps in the adaptation financing landscape. I mean, let's face it, it's a really lumpy landscape. Money flows to places right now where the business case is good, or where the sectors are most evident and the geographies are most ready. And we have a real challenge in making sure that certain places and sectors and people are not left out. And so I think in our presentation on the Green Climate Fund, we'll have one really good example of the way that international public finance can play an important role in catalyzing and filling gaps and making sure that some of those underserved areas and places are being reached. So while I would argue that the GCF is part of the volume, the response to the need for more money, it's also, I think, a way to ensure that the money that's being used is used more effectively. So with that, I'm really excited to turn over to our first panelist, John Furlow, who's going to talk about the planning part of this. John.
Thanks, John. If you can't hear me, Eric, just let me know. So thanks for coming. Thanks for having me on the panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing with something called the National Adaptation Plans Global Network. But before I get there, I'll give an overview of where this idea of NAPs came from. And I just wanted to say that this year I've been on a detail to the State Department. My regular job is with John at USAID. So what are NAPs? NAPs were introduced into the lexicon and into our thinking in the COP in Cancun, which I think was COP 16. And the idea was, there was a program called NAPAs, National Adaptation Programs of Action, which were intended, they were born in the early 2000s, and they were supposed to address urgent and immediate climate risks in the least developed countries. And they were, the 50th LDC had produced its NAPA in 2009 or 2010. And so the question was, what's next for developing countries, particularly the least developed countries whose emissions are very small, but the structure of whose economies are particularly sensitive to climate impacts. So the NAPA process was born, and a couple of the attributes the NAP process was born. A couple of the attributes that were particularly interesting was that NAPs are supposed to be to look across timescales, not just urgent and immediate needs, but also align the time of the impact you're concerned with the type of investment you're making. So the longer term thinking that John mentioned. They're also meant to be woven into ongoing plans, sectoral plans, national. So there was more of a focus on bringing more players into the climate game, excuse me, from across the government, including the private sector and ministries and agencies that may not have traditionally thought of themselves as having a role in climate change. This picture here on the right, and for the online audience, we're on slide 10. That's a picture my team worked with the country of Jamaica to help them develop a national climate policy. We looked at mitigation and adaptation. And what these folks are doing is we brought together people from about 150 people from across the government, not just the Environment Ministry. And we asked them to take apart their national development strategy, which had survived several elections. So it's called Vision 2030, and it's a part of the way Jamaica plans and does business now. All the ministries are bought in, they work from it, and they're working toward this vision, which the vision is that in 2030, Jamaica will be a developed country. So that's noble, and then they have a lot of components that they want to work toward. We asked them to take it apart, take out the things that you could identify as economic sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, construction, transportation, energy, and think about what it takes to make a robust, what are the inputs that you need for a robust agriculture sector? What are the inputs you need and the conditions you need for a well-functioning transport or energy sector? And that's what these folks are doing. They worked in multidisciplinary, multi-agency groups at small tables, and wrote stuff on yellow stickies and moved them around the flip charts. And I'll come back to this with the version that you'll be able to see. But the woman there who's leading the group is from the opposition party. I believe she's a health expert. This particular group is working on agriculture. And I think that the fellow pointing is the head of the Met Service. I can't quite recognize him from that angle. But so we had people from a variety of sectors working together, including the opposition party was adamant that they wanted to be a part of it. And the ruling party said, yeah, we want them in here. We want ownership of this process to be as broad as it is for the whole National Development Plan. So what do we see? Well, let me start with the graphic on the right. This is a one-page summary of the vision document of Jamaica's National Development Strategy. The things circled are things that seem like they could be impact climate change. And the yellow circle, the yellow circle is just to show that originally they had climate change down here. So when we initially talked with people about, in the ag ministry or in the different ministries, what are you doing about climate change? They said, oh, that's the climate change department's issue. We don't have to worry about that. And we would ask them, what are you doing about all these economic sectors? Well, we're the climate people. They're manufacturing, transport, whatever. So we wanted to bring these things together, and that was the point of having those multidisciplinary tables. So what do we see as the potential value of NAPS? I think it gives a real opportunity for the countries to take a leadership role, both in what they're doing domestically and then in working with the donors to make sure that their interests and needs are aligned with or are reflected in our investments. I think NAPS have the opportunity to get climate out of the environment box and shift the perspective of it from being an environment issue to being a risk to multiple economic and social activities. And that's going to be crucial because in most countries, the environment ministry is not the most powerful ministry. Finance, ag, depending on the structure of the country, have a lot more clout than environment. But if the climate department or the environment ministry is seen as indispensable to the function of the others, suddenly they have a bigger role to play. We try to emphasize that the process, that building those relationships is important, that coming back and looking at how things are going and treating it as an iterative process as the country works through its own domestic investments and as the donor community works through our investments and implementations. We need to evaluate, is it working or not? Make corrections and not just come up with a list of projects, work through it and hope for the best. And part of that process is making the connections between sectors and agencies. Hopefully when you work through the process, a process like the one we used in Jamaica, which is similar to processes that other development agencies are working with, you get a sense of prioritization. You see what's important, where do you need to succeed to achieve the development outcomes that the country is looking for. And again, we want to start viewing climate as something that affects multiple sectors. This is a sort of typed up version of that flip chart that you saw. This is from one of the tables in Jamaica that worked on agriculture. Agriculture was seen as a key component of the Jamaican economy. I think it comprises 20 or 30%, no, much smaller than that. 20 to 30% of employment, maybe 9 or 10% of GDP. But one of the bigger single sectors. So we combined crops, livestock, and fisheries. There were other groups that were working on transportation as an input to agriculture so that crops can get from farm to market. There was a group working on market structure. There was a group working on water availability and energy. But this is focused on the food itself. We started with the inputs are the production of these things. We talked about stresses. The red ones, these are all in red, are climate stresses, drought, storms. Then we asked, well, what are some responses? And this was done in a day and a half. So this was just preliminary to get people thinking about what they might do in response to impacts they'd either anticipated or already experienced. And you can see some of the things. Work on more resilient crops, which is sort of an exogenous thing. Somebody's got to develop those crops. Water harvesting is something that people can do on farm. So it puts more control in the farmer's hands. And then we ask, who in the government primarily do you need to enable these things to happen? And you can see that we saw the formation of multi-agency groups. It wasn't just the ag ministry, but transport needs to work with ag, energy needs to work with ag, the Water Commission needs to work with the ag ministry. And Jamaica has since chosen to go forward. The approach they're taking is a relatively thin framework adaptation plan, national adaptation plan, that points to each sector as needing to address climate risk in its sector planning. So it's getting woven into the way that they do business, which is what we were hoping to see. It's also enabling, now we have players that we can see need to do things. The yellow circles are highlighting that the meteorological department kept coming up as a gap. People didn't feel like they had good information, but the Met Service was underfunded and understaffed and under capacity. And so, and no one, until they began looking at this, you know, the Met Service was seen as the Met Service's issue. The ag ministry depends on it, but they didn't feel like they owned it. But when we pulled it together and said, you can't work with your farmers in a way that, and provide the information they need unless the ag ministry is more robustly helped, then they began to see it as sort of everyone's business, everyone's challenge, and not just these sector by sector ministries, or sector by sector issues. I believe, as AID was developing its program, we realized that a number of other donors were in the same place. We all did around 2010. And as the NAP process and the UNFCCC sort of took shape, our own programs were taking shape. We began talking with colleagues at GIZ and at DFID and at JICA about the fact that we were all beginning to provide support, and wouldn't it make more sense for us to learn from each other and in country try to collaborate or at least coordinate, so we're not asking for the same plan over and over and spending all of our time and all of our host country counterparts' time and energy going through repetitive operations when we could simply share and collaborate from the beginning. So we formed this NAP Global Network that's aimed primarily at bilateral agencies. There is a good bit of focus multilaterally, but we felt like the bilateral agencies were not kind of getting into weren't making strong connections with the UNFCCC processes, so there was a gap there. And so this NAP Global Network was launched last December at the COP in Lima. We've begun having activities. As I said, we're trying to promote better coordination among particularly the bilateral donors, not to the exclusion of the multilaterals, but starting just getting the bilats in country, talking to each other, working together. We're also trying to help the developing countries that have moved more quickly along in their processes, give them a platform to share their experiences with other countries that are maybe a few steps behind, but about to go through the same challenges that some of the leaders have done, and let the learning come from, you know, south to south rather than us coming in as consultants from the north. We've had a few activities. This was a great year to launch something like this because there's a lot of attention on NAPs and on adaptation in the run-up to Paris. It's also a terrible year because it's been a very busy year. And so we've had a few initial activities. I think that in January we'll really get rolling with some in-country activities, and our counterparts in the developing countries will have hopefully the breathing space to work with us more actively post-Paris. With that, I will turn it over to Laura to begin talking about this transition from you have a plan, how are you going to fund it?
Thank you, John. And thank you to everybody for being here this morning, and especially to the online audience as well. I'm going to talk about how we can strengthen readiness for adaptation financing. But before going into any details on that, I would like to start with a definition of what we understand under climate finance readiness. And I think it's very important that readiness is really not an aim in itself. And the picture at the bottom right on slide 15, I think shows quite well what climate finance readiness should contribute to. It should really contribute to a transition, to a transformational change towards more climate resilient societies. It should build the base for an effective and efficient and transparent use of financing in a way that really leads to this climate resilience. So which, for example, enables water storage, drip irrigation system, reforestation, all these very, very concrete adaptation results which will help societies and people to survive in the future. The other very important point about climate finance readiness is that it's really not just only about international public funds, even though that's what many people think about it at the first instance. And in a second, I'm going to talk a bit more about the important role of domestic funding and about using the national budgets for adaptation financing. And then the question of private investments is very important in the area of adaptation finance as well. And also just simple things about making companies understand the risks related, the very real risks related to climate change, and thus facilitating different investment decisions on their side. At GIZ, we implement a program on climate finance readiness, and we do that on behalf of the German Ministry for Development Cooperation, on behalf of USAID and the Czech Ministry of Environment. That program on the German side started with a very strong link to the Green Climate Fund. It started when the Green Climate Fund was just becoming operational and was meant to help people in that process, to help countries in that process of preparing themselves for the Green Climate Fund. In the meantime, we are also working a lot on issues that go far beyond the Green Climate Fund and international public finance, looking at the private sector and looking at domestic resources. We work very concretely in 11 countries and one region, which is the region of the Caribbean. These countries have been selected. It's a diverse range of countries, ranging from middle-income countries such as Peru and Vietnam to some very poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Countries have been selected in close communication with the countries themselves and with our funders. What we do under this program is that we support countries in the question of strategic frameworks, of how they can link this planning processes that John talked about with very concrete questions on how can these processes, how can these planned activities be financed. We work a lot on supporting institutions, very specifically at the moment for the Green Climate Fund. So we help, for example, national designated authorities to the Green Climate Fund to become better able to fulfill their coordinating functions. We help national institutions to get accredited for direct access. And we work on promoting private sector investments into mitigation and adaptation. And when we now look at readiness for adaptation financing in a more broad context, there's two very important points that I would like to make. The first one is the important role of national budgets in that context. And the second one is that question of moving away of having a list of project ideas to having very concrete projects that are with an underlying financing strategy, and how we get to this underlying financing strategy for these project ideas. If we start with the national budget, I think that is really important for a variety of reasons. First, Jonathan talked about the immense scale of adaptation finance that is going to be needed and that cannot be covered by international public funding alone. This is why this question of national domestic resources becomes very important. But even for poorer countries and for projects that are financed internationally, it's very important to take into account that almost all investment projects are going to have an implication on the budget in the medium term. They do need operation and maintenance. They do need staff. Some measures need implementation costs. So all of this is logically or should have an impact on national resources. And it's also inherent into the NAP process itself, because mainstreaming something into planning is only going to lead to implementation if it's also going to be mainstreamed into the budgeting processes. And for that aim, one of the GIZ projects has developed a tool which is called NAP Align, and that basically provides a conceptual framework for identifying entry points into these budgeting and planning processes, both into medium-term processes and into annual processes. Within our climate finance readiness program, over the past 1.5 years, we have, for example, worked with the government of Namibia on trying to do exactly that, trying to do trying to mainstream climate change adaptation considerations into their budgeting process. That was a very interesting process. They did develop now a roadmap for how to take this further and how to really fully do this mainstreaming. We also learned in that process how important it is to work with the right people in the right institutions, and also how important, once you start talking about money, how important it is to take into account the political economy. Once you move from climate change being just an issue for the Ministry of Environment, but you start talking to the more powerful ministries, it's very important to understand how decisions are taken and what are the incentives for people to take these decisions. So this work in Namibia was a very interesting learning process also for us in that respect. The second point that I mentioned previously is the question of and the importance of financing strategies for investment projects. So what we learned, what has happened a lot in the past, is that these adaptation planning processes have come up with really important lists of projects, of activities that should be implemented. But very often these are kind of technical climate change specialists, environmental specialists, and this development of project ideas very often did not talk to or did not take into account the views of real financial sector experts, of the people who would fund these projects. So in this case, we started working with the government of Tajikistan. Tajikistan, in the frame of the PPCR program and with the help of the Asian Development Bank, they developed a list of potential adaptation projects, quite a long list. What we did together with the sector ministries is that first we tried to do a costing of these projects. A costing not just of the investment costs, but also taking into account operation and maintenance costs, costs for the planning, for the implementation of the process. And we developed a costing template that helps the sector ministries to do that. The next steps then for such a financing strategy are to categorize projects according to the appropriate financial instruments. That's also something that is important in the context of the Green Climate Fund. The question, can something be financed through a high or low concessional loan, or is it something that can only be financed through a grant, for example? Once you have done that exercise, it is possible to identify potential financing sources. And also in the case of Tajikistan, once we had costed the projects, we compared the project characteristics with the requirements of international climate finance sources, for example, from the GCF. And that now really helped the government to understand which of these projects they can use to apply to which of the international climate funds. And that's really a process which made this list of projects, this initial project pipeline, much more concrete and much more investable. I think to some extent, international climate funds can help countries or somehow incentivize countries to go through that process. And in that context, an interesting incentive can be the country programs that the GCF encourages countries to develop voluntarily to demonstrate how they plan to use GCF funding more strategically. And that's also something that within the Climate Finance Readiness Program, we help countries to develop these country programs. And I think this is also a nice point to hand over to James to hear more about the Green Climate Fund.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you to CEADIR for having invited me here today. Good morning to our online audience and to the people who are here today. We heard from John about the work needed to do the planning for adaptation investments, and we've just heard from Laura about some of the great work that's being done to get institutions, players, and projects ready for the financing. And I want to talk to you about how that financing will be brought to make these investments for adaptation. And I think the first thing we need to look at is what are the financial flows in the climate space today? And I'm going to, for that, look at this chart which has been produced by the Climate Policy Institute. And I'm not going to say a lot about it, excepting I think there are two things that leap out at you from this graphic. The first is adaptation, right up at the top on the right-hand side, gets a very small share of total climate finance today. This is both developed and developing countries. That's an important point. And the second is, if we take a look at the private sector, that's sort of the gray, blue, and the red, as opposed to the purple, the major proportion of what flows for climate finance today is private sector. At least 2/3 is private sector. So I think this is really important when we think back to what Jonathan said, that the needs for adaptation in the developing world are likely to be in the high teens or perhaps the hundreds of billions of dollars a year going forward. And we're seeing that globally, including the developed world, adaptation picks up at most a quarter of that amount. So adaptation is not today really being financed. And the question is, why is it? Why is all the money going to mitigation? This is an interesting question. And the answer is I think, mostly because mitigation projects are revenue generating, which means the private sector can invest in these projects and get a return or get the debt paid back. The barriers to the investments can be quite easily identified as either being more costly than the non-climate friendly alternative. That is, the wind generation project would be more costly than a gas-fired gas turbine, for example, or a diesel-fired gas turbine. Or there's a market failure. There's not the market able to deliver, for example, those energy efficiency investments, even though people know they need to be done, but there are no operators who know how to do it in that economy. Or perhaps that the investment may make sense, but needs very long financing, sort of 15 years, but the local banks will only lend for 6 or 8 or 10 years. So we know about why, and these are things that we've been quite good at overcoming, identifying the incremental cost, putting in place those kinds of instruments. Adaptation is different. Adaptation is firstly in low-income, vulnerable countries, often with lower capacity. It's much more difficult to identify revenue-generating projects. For example, if we reinforce a road infrastructure to make it more resilient to storms and to climatic events, in most low-income countries, they are not toll roads and they don't generate income, and therefore providing a loan for this investment, it becomes very difficult to know how that loan would be serviced. Adaptation investments, difficult sometimes to identify the effectiveness. This is in terms of the return on the investment made. We know they'll be affected, but we actually don't know what the future environment will be like and what the kinds of events will occur. It's very probabilistic and requires quite complex modeling. And there's no investment abatement curve like mitigation. So it really is quite difficult to know, and this, I think, explains why adaptation hasn't picked up more financing. But I actually now want to talk to you about the Green Climate Fund and what we would like to do in the area of adaptation. The Green Climate Fund is a financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, the big climate treaty. We were created at COP17 in Cancun, but we really started business in December of 2013 when our headquarters were set up in Songdo in South Korea. And in the 2 years since we were set up, we've essentially, with the board has taken some very important decisions on the design of the fund. We've gone round to potential contributors. We've obtained $10.2 billion of financing into the form of pledges. The majority of those have been converted to actual cash or promissory notes. We've basically worked with our readiness colleagues on national designated authorities and on getting pipelines of projects. And about 3 weeks ago, we approved the first series of 8 projects that I'll talk to you a bit further in a minute. But I think the important thing about the Green Climate Fund, unlike some of the other funds, is that we have a real objective at the board level to try to achieve a balance in terms of volume between adaptation and mitigation. So rather than having 85-15, 85 for mitigation, 15 for adaptation, we really would like to do 50-50 or even more, and particularly in the most vulnerable countries. So of that 50% in vulnerable for adaptation, we would like 50% of that, the total of 25% of our total financing, going to the most vulnerable countries, city-state, small island states, sub-Saharan African countries and the like. And so when projects are prepared, thanks to Laura's readiness, based on plans that John has helped put in place, they come to the board, and we in the Secretariat do a quick check that they're in line with our environmental social safeguards, that they're fiduciary, this makes sense. But then we also provide an assessment, which is then, if you like, cross-checked by an independent external panel on the basis of 6 criteria. The 6 criteria the board have determined that they want to measure these projects against. And the first is impact potential, and that's kind of a no-brainer. In mitigation, it's how many tons of CO2 are we reducing or eliminating or avoiding. In the case of adaptation, it's what is the affected community, how many people, how vulnerable are they, or do they belong to the most vulnerable part of the country, and the like. The paradigm shift potential, the second criterion that you see here, is essentially how much will this project have systemic change the way people look at adaptation, look at potential for doing things differently in this country or elsewhere that won't necessarily require more GCF money to do. And are we actually changing the way people think about the problem? Sustainable development potential, these are the co-benefits, the wider benefits and priorities that the project would have from a developmental sense. We're working in developing countries, very poor countries. The needs of the recipient are to make sure that the money goes to those who have fewer choices, so try to go for the countries that can't access markets, that don't have a major multilateral or bilateral funding, the ones that need the money the most. Country ownership, and we get back to John and Laura, this is how much is the country on board with making this project a success, because without country ownership, we can put lots of money into a great project, but it won't be a success. So how much do they want this thing to happen? And then the efficiency and effectiveness, these are measures of things like rates of return, of financial validity, and how the thing generally works in terms of our normal kind of financing measures. And so 3 weeks ago, we approved 8 projects for a total of more than $600 million, $624 million. Of those, 6 were adaptation projects, as you can see. We're really making a big effort. The thing that you'll see is that we've, 6 out of the 8 are adaptation, but in terms of actual dollar amounts, these tend to be smaller, which is getting back to what Jonathan said earlier about the fact that adaptation projects tend to be more difficult to manage. Peru, we funded a project to help indigenous communities in this wetland delta, this carbon-rich wetland delta, have more resilient lifestyle. These are 7 ethnic groups of very, of indigenous people. In Malawi, we helped the government scale up its climate information early warning system to help them deal with catastrophes. In Senegal, very interesting, there's a delta that's becoming salinated through lower rainfall and rising sea levels, and where the fund will help essentially local communities adapt their agricultural methods to deal with these changes. Bangladesh, dealing with one of the biggest ministries that basically has a $1 billion budget, help them make this is the infrastructure ministry, help them make this infrastructure, these infrastructure investments resilient to climate change. And then Maldives and Fiji. Fiji is an interesting one. Rising sea levels have meant that the intake for the water system, the drinking water system, is becoming salinated, and helping them move the intake and essentially make the whole drinking water system much more robust to climate change, both rising sea levels and to climatic events. So in closing, Michael, I just wanted to make 3 points. Firstly, that essentially we can see that that this is just a start. 600 million. We are a $10 billion fund, and we hope to be approving $2 to $3 billion, of which half will be adaptation going forward. So we want to put a lot of money into adaptation. The second is, you can sort of see from what Jonathan said, 10 billion in the Green Climate Fund is not really going to crack the problem. That it's a start, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And the third is, this means that the money that we put in and the money that other public entities put in, to echo what I think everyone has said, needs to, rather than just go in the form of plain vanilla grants, needs to be used in a much smarter way to mobilize other sources of financing, and in particular to mobilize financing from the private sector. So Mikell, with that, back to you.
Thank you so much, James, and all of our panelists here for that really insightful view into the work that you've been leading around the world on planning, readiness, capacity strengthening, and mobilizing finance for adaptation. I think you've given us a lot to really chew on here. And now comes the most exciting part of our event today, and that's questions from you, all of us sitting here with us today, and all of us joining us globally. So please start thinking. I'm going to ask you in a moment for what questions you'd like to pose to these experts. But to kick off our Q&A, I'm going to ask an initial question that's been on my mind and which really came up as I was listening to some of the things that you pointed out for us. And then I'm going to ask Jonathan to ask the panel a question that's been on his mind. And then we'll turn to you for your questions. So, you know, James, maybe going back to your slide on the landscape of climate finance. I just found that really profound, related to what Jonathan noted at the start, you know, that it's estimated we need $300 billion a year by 2050 to address global adaptation needs. And looking at the upper right-hand corner of your the slide on climate finance landscape, the very small amount that's going to adaptation right now. But this graph, I think, really illustrates that, you know, there's a much larger landscape, in addition to the Green Climate Fund, of funds and financing mechanisms out there that have been designed to help developing countries address climate vulnerabilities. And Laura, you pointed out the very important process that countries need to go through of costing their priority adaptation measures and then identifying what are the best financing mechanisms for each of those priority measures, whether it's different types of concessional loans or grants or GCF funds. And so I'd be really curious as to your perspectives of what are the best ways for countries to strategically access and leverage all of the funding and support resources that are potentially available to them. And Laura, you talked a little bit about the process that your program, the Readiness program, is going through to help countries do that. But I'd love to know, because you are looking at this landscape of mechanisms, what are the best ways, some of the best practices you've seen countries take to access all of those resources available to them? Anybody, jump in.
Yeah,
Sure.
maybe perhaps I'm still warm from my talk, so let me jump in now right away. You're absolutely right, Mikell. You know, I did a quick sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation. I found 27 climate funds. These are, for example, the climate investment funds with the Clean Technology Fund, the World Bank, the many bilaterals, you know, KfW, differed in the UK. So there's sort of a lot of climate, and they're kind of small, many of them, and the public sector climate finance architecture is rather messy today. It's not very efficient. Lots of different things are going on. But I think it's important to go beyond just these funds to say, if we see what's going to be done, and we get back to what we heard earlier, it will go on in the countries. There will be external money, but most of it will probably come from within the countries and from government national budgets, but also from local private sector. Because, you know, worldwide, we invest about $5 trillion in infrastructure every year. World GDP, or world product, is about 85 trillion, and 5 of that goes into infrastructure. And it's been estimated that we essentially need another 500 billion a year to green that investment. And that infrastructure financing comes mostly from within countries. And so it's important that we go to where the money is being devoted now and get to work on that. So we in the Green Climate Fund can come in and help change things nationally, but we have to see that what's really going on, the real game, is occurring within the countries themselves.
Yeah, Yeah, maybe an additional perspective on that question from more of a readiness point. I actually think that these NAP processes can be really, really important starting points for this strategic use of the different funding mechanisms that are available, because the NAP process, per definition, takes a broad strategic view on where the adaptation priorities are, which sectors really need to act in a very short term, which the most important priority actions. And I think it's very important to combine that kind of political and planning process with that strategic question on the strategic adaptation priorities. What are our strategic funding options, and which maybe international climate finance options are maybe not of interest to a country, and which are really, really promising because the priorities of the funding options match the types of investment priorities of the country. So combining the planning processes of a NAP with that strategic view on financing, I think that's a really important way forward. And within our readiness program, we have just started working with Cambodia on exactly this type of process. There's already a NAP process that is supported by UNDP, I think. And with our support, we complement that NAP process with the question of how can we develop a financing strategy for the adaptation plan that will come out of the NAP process. And we plan to do something similar with Tanzania as well. So there's going to be some examples hopefully soon.
So I have a couple of thoughts. I agree that the NAP process is a powerful tool for doing this. I think a couple of aspects of that. One, it takes the strategic look and helps countries see what's really important for their growth. I think if by bringing multiple partners, both domestically and the international development community together on that, the countries and the donor community can begin to see where there's overlap. And given what Jonathan pointed out, that there's a gap between investment and at least estimated need, every duplicated effort is a dollar spent on something that can't be spent on something else. So just by aligning and becoming more effective and efficient in our investments, we can at least stretch the dollars that are going into adaptation. And I think part of that is taking this broad look at what needs to be done, what's important, and what's already being done, and how do we bring it all to bear. And then I think the adaptation community needs to sort of broaden our view of what constitutes being ready for adaptation, and clearly finance is a big part of that. I need to sort of re-educate myself that it's not just figuring out where the problems lie and how to solve them, but then also getting someone to pay for it. And so I think we need to get, again, moving the issue out of the environment ministry, the environmental piece of our brains, and remember that getting these things paid for is important, and getting them paid for, getting the project designed in a way that makes them fundable is very important.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, I'd love a question on your mind, if you could pose one to the panel.
I'm happy to do that. Just maybe add one thing. I really want to echo what James pointed out, which is that the challenge with the adaptation financing gap is that it depends how you categorize adaptation financing. The kind of hidden part of the iceberg, in a way, is all of the funding in countries that's paying for the sectors that are going to be dealing with these climate risks. And if we can shift and mainstream, as people have said, those funds and the way they're being spent, they, in a sense, become adaptation funding. They may not get counted in the roll-ups that we see different international organizations doing, but really that's a really big part of this, and it underscores the need for the funds that are adaptation labeled as such to be catalytic and to be strategic, so that we can really turn the boat in these other sectors and spend the money in a more climate resilient way. I will now pose a question to the other three panelists, which is not surprisingly to go back to the private sector point that I raised at the beginning of the panel. We all agree that adaptation, as James said, is a tougher nut to crack maybe for the for the private sector because of some of the reasons he's given, and yet it's going to be a really critical piece of the puzzle of the solution. So I just wondered if each of the panelists might say something about how the private sector may be better engaged in the process or the institution that you've spoken about. So in the NAP process, in the readiness work that GIZ is doing, and in the Green Climate Fund. What opportunities are there to increase that involvement and then hopefully increase their part of the funding picture?
Sure. So I'll go first. So when we, in these different countries, we try to bring in representatives of the private sector, and particularly in poorer developing countries, we have to remember the private sector includes many, many individual farmers. So a lot of our development work is helping farmers, and they're making decisions. They're just very atomized, and we may not be able to aggregate them up the way you could say, oh, someone built a wind farm instead of a coal-fired power plant or something. But again, as I think Jonathan said, or maybe it was James, a lot of the investments that we make, that governments make and that the donor community makes, are to help farmers and other small businesses do their jobs better. A robust road is not something that you're going to necessarily charge everyone who moves food or tourists or whatever up and down the road, but it's there as a service, and it's what the public sector has always done to enable more private sector activity. And so we may, in one sense, we may never get to the point where it's easy to say, the private sector is going to invest in these things because they benefit from public sector investment, just like they always have. On the other hand, by bringing them into these workshops and these discussions, they may begin to see how their activities are affected, how it's in their interest to either advocate for public sector investment that's more robust, or to start thinking about how their activities could be affected in the near term and in the longer term. And so I think by educating, by raising awareness, and by enabling them to think about how they are connected to public sector investments, we may begin to see more engagement and, in a diffuse way, more investments in things that will build resilience.
Yeah, the experience of GIZ is quite similar to what John just said, is that we see two angles to this question of how to involve the private sector into adaptation investments. And one is certainly providing the right financial incentives, for example, covering the incremental costs of more climate resilient infrastructure. This may indeed be a cost that also in the future the public sector will have to bear in order to mobilize these private sector investments. But the other angle is really also building capacities, raising awareness with the private sector on the risks and opportunities, and especially also on the risks that climate change poses to their businesses. And once private sector understands these risks, they really change their investment decisions. This is what they do very well. And we have seen experiences on that, both from the developed and the developing world. Very interestingly, in Europe, we had a couple of really severe storms in the mid-90s, and that really changed the way how electric utilities were building and planning their power stations and transmission grids. And I think it was a combination of these storms just happening, and these storms happen every, 30, 50 years, but then also taking into account the fact that these storms are likely to happen more often in the future. And that has really changed their investment decisions. And it's not something that is counted probably as adaptation finance, but it is a very clear example of how private sector can react. And GIZ did something maybe a bit similar in the sense that we worked with small and medium-sized enterprises in India, really industrial companies, for example, in the textile industry. And we demonstrated in a very simple manner to them the likely water shortages and temperature rise that may occur in the future. And that really made them consider using more water-efficient technologies, just making small changes in their investment decisions. So this raising awareness on the risks related to climate change may be a really powerful tool to involving the private sector.
Well, thank you, Michael. This question about how to mobilize the private sector better, I'm going to take it sort of in two parts. One is what are we doing in the GCF, and then second, more broadly. In the GCF, we work with and through accredited partners. These are partners that we've essentially done due diligence on and that we want to work with. We ourselves are not going to get in the retail business, they do it. And we have, our board has accredited a number of private sector partners and will continue to do so. For example, Deutsche Bank is one of our international accredited partners. Acumen, which is an impact investment fund, second. We work with sort of development banks that work with the private sector, like KfW of Germany, like EBRD, and so on. So that's the first, is that we really want, because they can access the markets and the investors, and we can crowd in private money by putting a small amount of GCF money through something that they've designed. But I think more broadly, going beyond the GCF for adaptation financing, we're getting back to what John said, the need for these to be structured, I would say much more cleverly, adaptation investments. We got, for the 8 projects that that our board approved 3 weeks ago, we got about 180 project financing requests. And I didn't go through all of them, but I went through a lot of them. And what struck me was the degree to which the request came in, give us a grant, a plain vanilla grant, to do this. And the reality is, if we sum up those 100, there's no way we can do them. Very few came in to say, if you GCF will provide some dollop of financing that will essentially be a credit enhancement vehicle, which will allow the private sector to come in with the kinds of risks that they can manage that Laura mentioned, then you go from a grant of, let's say, 10 from the GCF suddenly becomes financing of 100 from the GCF and private sector and semi-public, private, and development banks and the like. And I think that's what we've got to do, is be much more astute in terms of leveraging the scarce public money, international and national, so that it can crowd in the non-public money, which is where it is. And that's what I think the next step is, that we have to think a lot more about how to do this in a very kind of a creative, intelligent way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, all, for your thoughts. We're going to turn now to questions here in the audience, and also to questions from people who are joining us all over the world via webinar. And I'd just like to say that we have 77 people online right now joining us, over half of which work in adaptation adaptation planning and financing from over 20 countries around the world, including Germany, Belgium, Thailand, Chad, Mozambique, the US, Canada, and many other countries. So it's so good to really have this be a global conversation. For those of you online, questions from you that we're going to ask in just a moment, keep please submitting your questions to Joan in the chat box. We'll address those here, and for those that we can't address in the time that we have, we will send them to our panelists and have them share any thoughts they have in the follow-up email that we send to everyone who registered for this event as soon as it's over. So with that, I'd like to pose one question from our webinar audience and then take a question here from our in-person audience. And this first question to the panel is an interesting one. We've had a lot of really good technical and financial discussion here today. This one's a little different, but it's I think, a very good question. It's from Bien Pambe Patalet, and my apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. They ask, most of the countries which implement the skills in the financing of adaptation are English speaking. Is language a barrier in the comprehension in the mechanism of financing climate change? Also, the process of funds are different one another. Is harmonization not possible to make them easy? So we've got a couple different aspects of that question. A lot of this work happens in English. Is that a barrier for what some countries are trying to do? And then, the process of funds, mobilizing finance is different with different mechanisms. Is there harmonization possible? Who would like to take the start of that question?
I mean, so
Please.
From our experience at GIZ, yes, language is a barrier. It is very difficult, for example, for Francophone Africa, for other countries where people are just not completely fluent in English. It is a challenge. We try to translate as much of the advisory services and technical documents as possible. But it is also a difficult to overcome challenge.
Other thoughts? James?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I agree with Laura, what Laura said. I mean, for example, we in the fund work in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, but the reality is all our documentation is in English, and all of the submissions of funding have to be in English. And that's the way it is, simply because there's a transaction cost. You know, we want to be efficient, and we don't want to spend all of the scarce money on translating. But this is a real problem. I recognize it. In terms of the harmonization, I couldn't agree more. You know, the 27 small funds are out there. Each has a separate procedure. Each fund has a separate reporting mechanism. If a country gets funding from several of these different funds, you have to submit several different kinds of proposals, and you have to report and so. This is very inefficient. I think this is, I hope, in the COP in Paris, there at least will be some thought to try to harmonize the different kinds of climate finance or public sector climate finance that are out there.
Thank you, James. Yes.
Just to add one thing on that, which is I think there's the application procedures themselves, and then there's the readiness. And I think one of the benefits of programs like the GIZ program you've heard about is that broad approach to readiness that recognizes that some things are actually good for multiple reasons, right? Getting some of the institutional procedures and policies and budget decisions in place hopefully helps countries access multiple sources of funding. So there's still a huge challenge on the application side, but hopefully that's part of the solution.
Thank you. Yeah. John, any thoughts on this?
I think they did a great job.
Okay, excellent. Let's take a question here from someone in the audience. Please, yes. And please state your affiliation and your name for the
my name is Ashley King. I'm the climate change team lead for USAID Indonesia. So I feel like I'm sitting a little bit in both worlds, in that I'm an American and a bilateral donor, but my work experience in this area is very bilaterally based, looking at one country's system, one country's vulnerabilities. To sort of pick up on this question about barriers, one of the things that I'm wrestling with on sort of the operational day-to-day basis of how to make this happen and how to make it happen at scale is not just the language barrier, but more of the capacity issue. And let me give you a quick example. We're transitioning from one project cycle to another. So all of our last 5-year projects are wrapping up, and we're putting in place our next 5-year projects. In our previous funding cycle, we took our adaptation funding and put it into each one of our big sectoral projects. So our terrestrial biodiversity, marine biodiversity, water and sanitation, clean energy, to integrate adaptation into those projects. And what we found at the end of those projects was that the specialists who were implementing those projects, even though they were the best technical experts that Indonesia has available, English speaking, very skilled in their sector, really couldn't look at the sector and say, what is the most strategic use of this adaptation funding in this sector? And so the results we got from that funding were definitely, from an adaptation point of view, suboptimal. And when you talk about this planning and financing, what you're really going to do, or what we're going to try and do, is do that kind of exercise in all of the sectors for all kinds of institutions, government institutions, private sector institutions. And one of the real barriers I see is finding that capacity, that ability to look at these sectors in all different kinds of institutions independently, not through a guided process, and sort of say, like, what is adaptation and what are we trying to do about it? And how do we use our money best? And I guess I was wondering if you guys had thought about this question. Do you think it's an area for individual funding, putting this kind of education or capacity building out there? I'm interested in your thoughts on this barrier.
We'd like to jump in on that. It's a great question. This is where the rubber hits the road.
I'll take a shot at it. Hi, Ashley. Good to see you. So I think this is, like with a lot of things, this is something that we want to happen, and getting it going is going to be hard. The place where I have the most experience is in working in Jamaica, so I keep coming back to that example. The Jamaican government decided that the best way for them to deal with adaptation was, as it sounds like you did in Indonesia, they want to address it through sector planning. And they appointed 26 climate change focal points across 26 ministries and agencies. I think it was 26. And then, so these people, I assume these people got an email. And they were told, okay, on top of everything else, now you're the climate change focal point. And I'm sure that a lot of them said, good luck. Oh my Lord, I don't even know what that means. So we went back and did a training for them and tried to work with them to help them think about the responsibilities of their, what is the mission of their agency or ministry? Where, who depends on them? If it's Ag Extension, they work with farmers. If it's the Met Service, it's a lot of other agencies. If it's the Water Authority, they've got to deliver water, whatever the conditions that are prevailing in a given season, and so on. And so we tried to work through a process of helping them think about what are their responsibilities to their audience, to their clients, who do they depend on, do they have adequate relations with the people that they depend on and the people that depend on them, and then in trying to deliver year by year on their mission, on their annual work objectives, whatever. Where are climatic problems going to come up and where are non-climatic problems going to come up as well? Because they could be perfect on the climate stuff, but if they haven't gotten paid in 6 months, they may not show up every day. If they don't have a computer, I met some people in, I believe it was Ghana, who did, in the Environment Ministry in Ghana, they did a lot of their work at night, at home, because their personal laptops were more powerful than their work computers. It may not have been Ghana. We were in Ghana, but it may not have been Ghanaians. So I think helping them lay out what they need to achieve, where there are going to be potentially climate disruptions in the near term and in the longer term, and other problems so that they can get it laid out is a good first step. In Jamaica, we are trying to set up the Jamaican government is trying to set up the climate department as a resource for these 26 focal points. And then the government is committed to a dozen climate smart sector plans, and they are working with different donors on each one. They have a common framework, common approach to them, but AID is supporting 4 or 5, the EU is supporting some, the World Bank, et cetera. And we're trying to continue to have sharing of lessons across and have this central resource in the climate department. But it may take a few years to get there.
Thanks, John.
I just want to add to this on Ashley's question. Look, we are also part of the problem. We, the countries, the agencies trying to make this happen. There's scarce capacity in these countries, and we take up a lot of it by our requirements for reports, for meetings. I spent 25 years at the World Bank, and I lived in some of these countries. Madagascar, the President, the Prime, and the Minister of Finance spent all their time receiving delegations from GIZ and USAID and the World Bank, and then preparing reports. So I think a lot of this, we have to think in terms of our requirements, because we have shareholders that want to know how the money we're deploying is being used. But we have to be much more, I think, user-friendly for our clients, these countries, and recognize their scarce capacity that has to go for the kinds of things that John was mentioning.
Fantastic point, James. Laura, anything to add?
Maybe I just wanted to, from the side of GIZ, we fully agree with the fact that this long-term capacity building is going to be needed in the future. But just adding a bright point to this, from our experience working with institutions going for direct access to the GCF, we also noticed an amazing amount of capacity with some of these institutions. Some of these institutions that are now accredited, because sometimes international support is slow, we were not able to provide the full help with the accreditation support or the full help with developing the proposals. And they did it themselves because they realized it's an opportunity, it's important for their future business. And I found it really amazing what capacities are there already.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to take a question from the online audience, and then we'll take another question from someone here in person. And I just want to mention, Joan, thanks for pointing this out. We started about 5 minutes late, so if it's okay with all of you, we're going to run about 5 minutes over. Is that okay? Because we got a lot of great questions. Just 5 minutes. All right. One question from Yuri joining us by webinar. Great to have you joining us, Yuri. Yuri asks, regarding accessibility of some of the global adaptation funds, Services for low-income and fragile states, particularly in the health sector, are facilitated by international NGOs and NGOs. However, when we look at civil society access to this finance, particularly in the context of the health sector, it seems quite low. Any thoughts from the panel about civil society access to some of these adaptation funds versus, the access that government entities have?
Yeah, this is again a funding question, and I'm not going to sort of refer to the GCF. We have 8 projects, and none of them in the health sector. But this is a good question. I'm going to sort of read into what this question says. Isn't there capture by the public sector? They have the access to GIZ, to USAID, to GCF, and aren't they capturing these resources for themselves? And this is a danger. This is true. Ultimately, we hope it'll get down to the local communities, but sometimes a lot gets absorbed on the way down in the form of salaries, trips, computers, whatever it might be. So I think this is a valid point. The issue for the climate funds, not just the GCF, is how do we get it to civil society, to the man and the woman in the street, in ways that respect our fiduciary requirements of the way this money should be used? This is not our money. We're not Bill Gates. This is money that's been put in our trust to get for climate adaptation, and we have a responsibility to make sure it doesn't end up in Swiss bank accounts or in a big Mercedes-Benz or whatever it might be. So we have requirements, and it's true that essentially civil society players have a great deal more difficulty in providing the kinds of safeguard that we need that governments do, and hence the need really to build the capacity of civil society NGOs that can be accredited to the GCF and to other funds, that they can essentially come to us, put in place the mechanisms that we need, so that then they can get better access to the funds directly without necessarily going through an international organization or their own government.
Great point. Thank you. Okay, if it's okay, we've got a lot of great questions, hands in the audience. Let's actually take 3 different questions from the audience, and then we'll have the panel respond to aspects of those. So please, one right here, and then one up here, and then maybe one over in this part of the room over here. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Darren Long. I direct a program called the Climate Adaptation Fund. Maybe there are 28, James, as you point out, through the Wildlife Conservation Society, which invests private philanthropic dollars in projects for climate adaptation for wildlife ecosystems and ecosystem-based adaptation that benefits human communities. So my question to the panel, and thank you, really thoughtful and informative discussion, great presentations, is do you see a role within your sphere for private philanthropic investment? How can we help you to do your job better? There was a lot of good points made about the need to learn what projects are effective, where you're seeing the greatest return on investment. Is there a role for private philanthropy in helping to create some sort of learning that increases your impact and your capacity to fund good projects?
Great, thank you. Let's take a question from the front row over here. The person bold enough to sit in the front row.
Eric Hyman, USAID Economic Policy Office. First, quick comment and 2 short questions. The quick comment is that the Climate Policy Institute has an updated report that was released a day or 2 ago.
Absolutely.
So people may want to check that out.
The numbers don't change too much, by the way. I checked them, but this is the previous one.
And the question for Laura is, does GIZ use any standard tools for diagnosing capacity for climate readiness? And a question for James is, based on experience reviewing applications for the first round, what's the successes and the non-successful ones? What recommendations would you make for applicants?
Great, and let's take one more question, and then we'll have the panel open up. Someone over here, 2 hands over here.
My name is Takuya Nomoto from Starting about the private sector involvement, but is there any criteria to be the suitable climate finance to contribute suitable climate finance? For example, how to ensure the transparency of private finance?
Great. How to ensure the transparency of private finance and criteria for that. Okay, thanks for those excellent questions. Who would like to start with some thoughts on some of those? Laura, please.
Maybe
Yes.
I start just with the very concrete question if there's a standard tool that we developed for diagnosing readiness. Yes, we did develop a tool. It's called Cliff Reflect. It consists of a number of questions on different aspects of climate finance readiness. There's a short and a long version, and that really helps to get an overview or a snapshot of where the country stands.
Is that available on the web?
I think you would have to send us an email.
Great. John and then James, please.
I'll comment on Darren's question. I think there's a huge opportunity, and Ashley and our other AID and GIZ colleagues can comment on this, but we often will hit the limits of what we can do either in a country or in a region. We may do something great in one country, but not have the right type of money flowing into another country. I think there's a huge opportunity to coordinate with the philanthropic community to either both replicate what we're doing that's working, or because we always have gaps in what we can do. And you can see that, you know, my kingdom for a horse. We need a little bit more somewhere, and we don't have it. I also think that working with you on looking at, you know, a review of what we're doing, and you may have a different perspective on what's working and what's not working, where they're doing something that we could do that would really leverage things. So I think there's a huge opportunity there.
Yeah, and very quickly, and I agree absolutely with John, that it's, for example, Conservation International, a very well-known NGO, they have been putting money into climate finance for a while, both on the ground and through, and they've basically become an accredited partner for the GCF. So we'll be leveraging their money and they'll be leveraging our money. So I encourage you to work collaboratively with other funds, including with ourselves. We'd very much like to have more accredited partners. Eric's question about the success, this was very interesting for me. First of all, what really fascinated me was just how innovative the whole climate finance space is. Really, it's extraordinary, some of the ideas that people are coming in up for. And the second, and I don't want to be disparaging, but how financially that you can do a lot better, we can do a lot better in getting a lot more money channeled if we think not just about how to be sophisticated in terms of the climate impact, the adaptation, but also how to go on the back end to get it financed. And I think further to this, I'm not sure I fully understood the question from Tatiana, but basically, if I understood it, it's the transparency of private sector financing.
For example, from the private cannot open everything.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, you know, there are many sort of work with the private sector in development, you know, IFC, KfW, and essentially they have cracked this nut. So the thing is that we make as much as we can transparent and public, and this is often a lot more than the company wants, but we think it's necessary. But then, of course, there are things that remain confidential in terms of things like pricing, in terms of things like specific technologies they use. This are not made public in terms of the project. And we have a couple in our first batch that respond to this. So it's a problem, it can be solved, it has been solved, and I think, you know, I'm not going to go into the details, but I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Michael, could I just...
Yeah, and Jonathan, please.
Just to add to, I think it was Darren's question, I mean, I think actually the other really powerful role of both the private philanthropy and some of the organizations it's working with is innovation. I mean, I think those of us who work in the sort of the larger behemoths of development, you know, it's harder to sometimes sort of stimulate the innovative approaches. And I think a lot of the really good lessons on, for example, ecosystem-based adaptation, which you mentioned, have come from the NGOs and the private funders, and we're starting to see them, you know, belatedly being absorbed into and reflected in the mainstream development. So I think that's a really powerful way to be working together too.
Great, thank you. We're getting a lot of really good questions online that, again, thank you so much for everyone around the world sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. We are going to wrap up, but I am going to take a number of the online questions that are kind of very similar, related to the urgency of our global efforts to help countries adapt to some of the climate change impacts they're experiencing, and maybe pose it in one wrap-up question to the panel that it relates to something that I've been thinking about this week as a couple new studies regarding climate change impacts have come out. Most recently, two studies, one from the World Bank just a couple of weeks ago, which indicated that climate change impacts may very well force 100 million more people into poverty by the year 2030. And the second study just a couple weeks ago, Central, which found that as many as 760 million people could be displaced from their homes by rising sea levels this century, with correlated to a temperature increase of 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what the world is on track for under a business as usual scenario. So given those two recent studies that we're learning more every month about the impacts of climate change, this urgency and this this critical need to protect those communities most vulnerable to climate impacts. A number of people on our audience have asked the same question too. Given this magnitude, this urgency, what are your hopes for the global climate agreement that world leaders will be discussing in Paris in less than 2 weeks from now? What do you hope to see come up in those discussions? What do you hope to see come out of those discussions regarding the world's ability to help countries adapt to climate change impacts? And I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that. John.
Well, I think there's a lot of hope that the process of getting the INDCs, the individually determined national contributions, did I get that right? Intended. That by sort of airing them in advance, that a lot of there won't be any surprises, at least, from what's revealed in those, and that we've been able to look at the emissions trajectory that would follow if everyone follows through on their INDCs. So I'm not directly involved in the negotiations, but I think there's an optimistic feeling going in. There are certainly risks. There's going to be a lot of questions about funding and how to make everything work and so forth. But I also hope that if we start making these transitions globally, that we'll get on a faster path, that there will be economies of scale revealed on the mitigation side that could lead to a more rapid transition than maybe we're looking at. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Good to hear. Thank you. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, personally, I really hope it's going to be an ambitious deal that comes out of Paris. But then I also hope that the sense of urgency that is expressed in so many documents and newspaper reports, that it really translates into senior decision makers' minds, that it really drives the investment decisions, the planning decisions in countries globally. Because I think that's really going to be crucial to avoid these impacts that are described in these reports.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, taking the long view, what we're coming up against is that there's a check that's being presented for our cost of our development, not just in developing countries, but the Industrial Revolution, Europe and the US. It's a check that basically, the way it's going to be settled will depend in Paris, either settled in the form of making investments to move away from, to move to a low carbon environment, get out of coal in the US and China, or alternatively, the same amount of money is going to have to be spent in dealing with the consequences of that, which is the adaptation, or it could be in the form of lower overall growth and less wealth. So the check has been presented. The way we're going to pay that will depend in Paris. I hope that they're going to be bold and make us pay it upfront in terms of moving to a low carbon environment. But if not, then we just have to bear with the costs of dealing with the adaptation, in which case the split for us won't be 50-50, but may end up by being 85% adaptation and 15% mitigation.
Interesting. Jonathan.
Yeah, I can only agree with what everybody said. I think we're all hoping for something that's ambitious and workable and involves all parties. And I think that's a very important point James has just made, that mitigation is part of the adaptation solution. If we can get a good agreement on the mitigation side, that will right the balance. There's going to be the costs we saw in my first slide. To some extent, no matter what, we're locked into some of that. But hopefully we can achieve a balance that ensures that that this isn't only falling on the most vulnerable and on the poorest. So.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to everyone who joined us here today in person and to everyone who joined us around the world. Thank you, John, Laura, James, and Jonathan, for all and thoughts you've shared with us today. It's a true honor and pleasure to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you. And I just want to let everyone know that a recording and copy of today's presentation will be sent to everyone who registered today's event, regardless of whether you were able to join us today or not in person. And these will also be posted on USAID's Climate Links YouTube page as well, so that people can watch this again and share it with others and watch previous CEADIR Series discussions also. So please join us for our next event, which will be announced soon to everyone who registered for this event. We'll have more information on that very soon. And again, thank you everyone for the fantastic experiences, comments, and questions you shared with us. This was really a wonderful time to connect globally with all of you on this. So thank you again, panelists. Appreciate it.